everyone, Carol from Segovia Quilts. Today in the sewing studio, we're going to be putting together this Scrappy quilt top. So let's get to it. Alright, so I have all of my scraps here in this one drawer. So this is fabric from years and years of different projects. Some of these fabrics I don't even remember what I use them for. I've had them for so long. But it's quite full, and I've been wanting to do something with all of these different scraps. So I want to do a scrap quilt, and I have some rulers that I'm going to be using for my pattern for the specific quilt. But these are scraps that I'm going to be working with. So first I need to go through them and figure out which scraps I'm going to use in this quilt. So I'm going to start separating my fabric. Alright, so I've laid out all the different, I guess, colorways of fabric. So I've got my browns, grays. These are pretty much going to be the whites. I don't know, I might have to take a couple of these out, we'll see. Blacks, yellow, orange, purple, light to medium blues, greens, dark blues, reds, teals, and pinks. I'm going to go ahead and start ironing these, and well, I'm going to count them to make sure I have enough for each of my pieces. If I do, then I'll start ironing them, and then I'll go ahead and start cutting out the individual pieces. So these are the rulers that we're going to be using to make our block for this Scrappy quilt that we're working on. So this is actually 5 separate rulers, but they are cut in a way that when you put each piece together, it makes this nice scrappy kind of block. So now when you line them up like this, because it has your seam allowance accounted for in the actual template pieces, it's not going to line up here on the edges. But again, once you actually sew the pieces together, it'll line up nicely. So these are what we're using today to cut out our pattern pieces. And I also have my rotary cutting mat here because it will be easier to cut out these pieces with this. One thing I do like about these ruler pieces is the tips are cut here for you. So when you cut your pieces out, you're not going to have what's called the dog ears on each piece. You definitely want to make sure to cut out these little tips because it's going to help when it comes time to sew your pieces together. So we're going to be using our mat, we have our rotary cutter, all of our fabric has been ironed, so we are ready to go ahead and start cutting. Okay, so I'm going to start with my reds because that's the fabric that was on top. So again, I have 5 pieces for my rulers here, so I need 5 different fabrics. So these are the fabrics that I put together. Now I do have more reds. I separated them over here, but I feel like they read more maroon than red. So I might do a whole separate block with these fabrics here. And for my reds, I've picked out these ones here. So now for my pieces, so again, I had said that the block makes more sense to me like this. For some reason, I don't know why. But I think for this top, I want to put my blocks on point. So that means instead of them being squares, like when you're looking at it, instead of it being a square, I want it to be like this. So the 2 points or the corners of the block will be down and up instead of a flat side. So because I'm going to be putting my blocks on point, whatever fabrics I use that might be directional, so now none of these are directional, but I do have some fabrics. So like here's a good example. So like this one, this was in my red pile, but I can't use it because it's too small for any of my pieces. This is the smallest piece here, and no matter which way I turn it, it's just not big enough. See, this one is barely big enough, but I'm missing this tip up here. So I can't use this, but if I were going to use it, I would need to make sure that it's facing the right direction. So I can't use this one, and none of these fabrics here are directional, so I don't have to worry about it right now. But some of them that I'm going to be using are directional, so I just need to keep that in mind when I cut out my pieces. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to find my smallest fabric, which is this one, and I'm going to get my smallest ruler piece, and this is going to be fabric for this one. And then again, I'll just kind of work my way up using the biggest pieces of fabric that I have for my biggest pattern pieces, which is going to be B and E for the most part, are the biggest. So yeah, so now it's gonna go ahead and start cutting. Alright, so this is my first time using these rulers ever. This is the first project I've used them on, and I was finding that for a couple of my pieces that I've cut so far, the rulers would move around while I was turning my rotary mat. So I added a couple of little sticky dots on, and there's a couple of different sizes. So you see that one, it's the outside, and then this one, that little tiny dot was on the inside of this one. So I added these to hopefully help prevent them from slipping around. And these are the ones that I use. I bought these online. If you're interested in them, I'll go ahead and put a link down in the description down below so you can check those out. But yeah, I cut these first 3 pieces and I was like, oh, okay, I don't like how they're sliding around. So I added a couple of little sticky dots, and now we are ready to keep cutting our next pieces. Okay, so I finished cutting out my pieces. So this is a pile of those pieces that I've cut out for all of my colors, and this is the pile of fabric that I cut those pieces from. So as far as like stash busting goes, the particular layout that I have in mind isn't really using up a whole lot of scraps. It's not going to be a quilt filled entirely with all of these blocks, so yeah. I guess if I wanted to use more of my scraps, I would need to do a quilt entirely of these blocks, but for this particular one, I'm not. So I'm not really using up a whole bunch of my scraps, but it's a little bit, so I guess it's a start, right? Alright, so now we can go ahead and start sewing each of these blocks together. So the easiest way to do it is to break it down into essentially 2 different sections. This section of the block and then this section. Alright, so I have my first 2 piles of fabric that I'm going to sew together. So now I have them stacked in the same order. So like here's my maroons, and then underneath it I have my pinks, and it, you know, it's the same order on both stacks. So, and this is the orientation that they need to be sewn together in. So we're gonna stitch right along here. So I'm going to get my first piece and this piece. So now I've sewn one together already, and I had started up here at the top by matching these 2 angles right here. Let's see if I can zoom in for you. So I started by matching up this little angle right here, and this is the little end snippets, the little dog ear portions that we made sure to cut off when we were cutting out our pieces. So originally I lined this up and sewed all the way down, but when I flipped it over, it was hanging down like maybe a 1/4 of an inch too far. So even though I lined it up here, it didn't end up matching up when I flipped it over. So what I'm doing instead of lining it up here, I'm lining it up here on the bottom. Let's see, where is it? There you go. I'm lining it up over here on the bottom. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. We'll zoom you out again. So I've put my pieces together, so this is how it's gonna be sewn together, and instead I'm just gonna start at the bottom by flipping it over here, and then again lining up those angles right there. So get that in there. And I like to backstitch my starting and ending seams on everything that I sew. All the way down. And now while I do plan on chain piecing these, I wanted to go ahead and show you all this first one. So this is originally how I had it laid out, this piece on top of this piece, and then you open it. So now, and I also found out that the direction that you put the seams affects how it looks. So let me show you what I'm talking about. So we'll zoom you back in. Okay, so now down here, this is lined up pretty nicely. I like the way that came out. But then up here, if you look at it right up here, it looks kind of wonky, right? It looks like it's not where it's supposed to be. So all we do is we flip the seam. The seam was on this side, or the extra seam allowance. So now if I flip it to the other side, okay, so let me show you back down over here. So this, again, still looks nice even though the seam is on this side now. And then on this side, now granted I haven't ironed it yet, but now on this side, you can see that that lines up a lot nicer. So it's something as simple as which direction the seam is going makes it look like it's wrong. So, I mean, again, and it's not necessarily wrong, it's just this little, I guess, dog ear is sticking out. So when I press everything, I'm gonna make sure I press everything to this block. Now, as far as seams meeting up, this isn't going to matter because you're not gonna have any seams meeting up. You're not gonna have to have these two seams meeting up with like the point of another seam, you know what I mean? So yeah, so this is the first one that we did and I like how that came out. So I'm just gonna set it aside and then I'm gonna go ahead and chain piece the rest of my blocks. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so I have this whole stack done and pressed and ready for the next piece. So here is my stack of little ending pieces, and this will make up these three pieces will make up the bottom portion of our block. So I'm ready to go ahead and attach these pieces to these two pieces. And just like I did with this one, I think instead of lining it up here, I think I'm gonna line it up on the bottom just because if I start off with an even bottom, then I will make sure I finish with an even bottom instead of trying to line up this, you know, fairly thin piece of fabric up here. I'm gonna go ahead and do it on the bottom. So I've got my two stacks and I'm ready to start sewing those together. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so now onto the second half of the block, which are these two bigger pieces. So again, I have them in the same color order. So now all we're going to do is sew this seam right here, and I'm just going to flip this over on top. And this edge right here is going to be the top edge of the block. This edge right here is actually going to be in the middle of the block, and it's this edge here that we're going to be sewing to the other half of our block where it has those three pieces on the bottom. So I'm going to flip these over and I'm going to line up this edge here because this is going to be the outside edge and then this will be the inside edge. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so both halves of my block are done and now we're ready to put them together. So this is the area that we're going to be sewing. So all we're gonna do is take the top half, flip it onto the bottom half. We're gonna line up our two edges, and again, this edge here has the little point snipped off so that we can line it up perfectly with this side over here. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so we have all of our blocks done here. Now the next step is to go ahead and square them up. Squaring up is where you essentially just make sure all the corners and the edges are the same. And the reason is because after piecing, you might end up with a couple of edges like this, where it's not exactly perfectly straight. There's a little bit of overhang here. So you want to get that cleaned up, but also you want to make sure all of your blocks are one consistent size, so when you're putting your quilt top together, you're not going to have to be doing all of this crazy math. You'll be like, okay, all of my blocks are 8 inches, and I know that's what I'm working with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and trim these blocks down to 8 inches. So once we're done trimming, it'll be 8 inches from top to bottom, 8 inches left to right, and then once we get it sewn into our quilt top, they will finish at 7.5 inches. So what I'm gonna do is, because I am using this piece here as kind of like my main focal point of each block, I'm going to measure off of here. So when I do my trimming, I'm going to put the corner of my ruler right on the corner of that, and then I'm going to adjust it just so that I can make sure I trim a sliver off of both sides. So I don't need to trim off a whole lot. I just want to make sure that I get a nice straight edge on these two sides here. And I think that looks good. And before I cut, I'm going to make sure that I will still have enough to trim off from this edge and this edge to get me that 8 inches raw block. So right now, so this is an 8.5 by 8.5 inch ruler. Right now, I've got about 1/4 inch inside the ruler here, so that means I have a whole another 1/4 inch that I can trim off once I'm done trimming this side here. So I think that looks good. Whoops. All right, so let's go ahead and give this a trim. Go there, and I don't think I got the corner here. There we go. And we'll get this side. There we go. And see, I'm just barely trimming anything off. I got just little fuzzies on that side, and this side we got a little bit of seams there. We can pull that away. All right, so that gives us nice edges on those two sides. And now we'll flip it around. And this is where I will go ahead and line it up on this edge and this edge to get my 8 inches exactly. And that looks pretty good. So now you can see what we're trimming off on these two edges here. So this was our kind of wonky side over here where it wasn't exactly perfect. And this side only has one seam on this side, but this one looks really good actually. But we're gonna go ahead and trim this down to 8 inches. And I did have a starter block. This was one that I did a tester before I did any of my cutting or anything like that, because I wanted to make sure that I liked how it looked. And this is the block that we're going off of for our size. So this one I trimmed down to 8 inches. So that's what we want to make sure the rest of our blocks are. So again, I'm just lining up both sides, and we can go ahead and trim that side. And that side. There we go. All right, so here is our red block. Again, we trimmed it down to 8 inches, and I use this as my main point because this is the fabric that I made sure if I had directional fabric, it was facing the right way. And this block, my maroon block, is a good block to show you. Let me zoom you in here. So again, because my blocks are going to be on point, how you see it here is how it's going to look in the quilt. This is going to be at the bottom or facing the bottom, and this is going to be facing the top. And so I made sure that the fabric that was in this block specifically if it was directional, I wanted it to be facing the right direction. So this is why I'm using this specific piece of my blocks as like the main focal point of each block. And I did have a couple of other blocks that had other fabric that was directional that I did try to go ahead and do some cute stuff, and you guys will see that a little bit later. Until then, I'm going to go ahead and finish trimming up the stack of blocks that I have here. Okay, so all of my primary blocks are done. I'm going to make an additional block for our quilt top, and I'm going to be using one of these pieces actually to do it. So in all of these pieces, now of course you could make another block using just one of these pieces, and then you would just have to fill in the extra fabric, whatever your background fabric is going to be, to make up the size of block that you need. So in my case, it's an 8 by 8 inch block. So because my primary focal point on my original blocks was this little corner piece, I'm going to be using this corner piece to make additional blocks. And this is the block that I'm going to be making to go along with our other quilt blocks. So again, this is this here corner piece, and the background for my quilt is going to be white. So I went ahead and put the two white pieces on either side of it, and I'm going to have one of these blocks for every color that I've done. So this is what it's gonna look like. I really like how it came out. So what I did is I cut out extra pieces of all of my colors when I was cutting out the pieces for my primary block, because I knew I was going to be doing this. So I've already got all of my pieces done, and then what I did is I cut additional background pieces to go along on either side. So now you could use the remaining pieces and cut individual pieces out of your background fabric if you wanted to. I didn't particularly want to do all of that extra work, so what I did was I did a lot of math and after some trial and error, I figured out the sizes of filler or background fabric that I needed to have for each side to make this block. So what I did is I cut out two pieces. Well, right here I've got my two pieces, but I did it in such a way that I cut a block and then I could cut it on the diagonal and get two pieces out of one block. So hopefully that makes sense, and let me show you what I did. So I'm gonna line it up on my mat here. Scooch that over. There, okay. So these are, or this is the block that I did, and this one measures 8 inches by 9 inches. And then all I did was I measured 2.5 inches over here, and I put a little mark, 2.5 inches over here, I put another mark, and then I just cut it on the diagonal. I had to increase this size to 8 by 9. Originally I had a 7 by 8, and that just did not leave me enough space to trim my final block. So I bumped it up 1/2 inch, and this works perfectly. So this is the first block. Now this is the littler of the two that I had to cut to make this additional block. Now because it has to go on a specific side. So this smaller piece will go on the left side of this specific unit or part of my block. It has to go on the left side because it's not big enough to go on the right side. So this will go on this side, and all you're gonna do is flip this corner piece over. Now you want to leave about 1/4 inch down here at the bottom, and let me zoom in just so you can see that right there. All right, you want to leave about 1/4 inch at the bottom here, and you're gonna have to do that because we don't have the angles, and this piece would be this piece right here. Normally, when you cut it out, you know, out of the scrap fabric and whatnot, you would nip off that little corner right there, and then it would line up perfectly with this edge here. Since I didn't do that using my pieces, I need to leave 1/4 inch hanging off on the bottom. So once you do that, you just line it up, and then you sew from the top all the way down, 1/4 of an inch. And after you do that, you will get this right here. So this is what it'll look like. Now obviously this angle is not right to be able to sew, you know, another straight piece of fabric on. And that's fine. What I did is before I cut it off, I wanted to make sure it was gonna work and everything was gonna fit. So next I got my next piece of fabric, and this one's gonna go on this side right here. I'm just kind of laying it over top so you can see. So these pieces that go on the right side, again, I did the same thing. I cut out one block of my background fabric, and this side measures 9 inches by 9 inches. And again, I went 2.5 inches in, put a dot, 2.5 inches in, put a dot, and then I just cut it on the diagonal. And so it goes like this. You lay it on top, and that's about what it'll look like. So then all you do is, again, lay it over top. You want to leave yourself, again, about another 1/4 of an inch here. And you'll notice up here, it's not lining up perfectly. There is a little bit, maybe it could be a scant 1/4 of an inch difference here, but because we had to make these pieces so much bigger, we're going to be able to trim it down once we're done sewing it together. So that is not a big concern. All right, so you'll do your 1/4 of an inch seam from top to bottom, and once you do that, you will get this. So this is what it'll look like once you sew both pieces on. So now again, I did not cut off the extra fabric because I wanted to make sure everything was gonna be good in case I had to, you know, take my seam ripper to it. Luckily I did not. This was after I redid my math. So now this is what it'll look like. So now I will go ahead and trim off this extra fabric here. All I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna take my ruler, I'm just gonna line it up on each corner here and snip that off. And I already ironed this open, so my seam is already on the side that I'm wanting it to be on. So this is what it'll look like. Now when I did this, obviously white, you can see the seams underneath, which there's nothing you can do about it, but I did go ahead and press both of my seams to this centerpiece so I can at least hide the white on these edges. There's nothing I can do about this seam right here. So there's that, and now once you get that, then we can go ahead and trim it down, and you'll see how much extra we have. So again, this is an 8.5 by 8.5 inch ruler. I have extra material on all 4 sides, but we only need an 8 by 8 block. So I'm just lining it up down here just to make sure, again, that this piece is my focal point. So we'll go ahead and snip that edge. Oops. Got this. And again, I'm just taking off just barely. I mean, look at you, just little tiny pieces here. I'm not taking off a whole lot because I don't need to. Line that up. And take that off. There you go. So that's those 2 sides. And I'm just gonna line this up. Again, I only need my block to be 8 by 8. So I'm lining it up on my outside edge here. And see, look at all this extra that I had to play with. Because when I did it with the smaller pieces of my background fabric, there was not enough fabric at all. And I had to take my seam ripper to it twice, I think it was. Oops. So yeah, definitely go with the bigger size. It helps tremendously. All right, so this is what the blocks will look like once it's nice and trimmed down. And again, it's the same size as our other blocks here. There, see, perfect. So I have all of my blocks. I cut out all of my white blocks here, so I'm ready to start doing my layout. But I wanted to show you some of the different kind of patterns that you can do with this specific block on top. So I laid it out real quick just in the color pattern that I think I want to try and do for my quilt top. But I wanted to show you all, like I said, the different patterns that you could do with some of these blocks. So if you put it so that, again, I'm going to have my block oriented this way in my quilt with this bigger part facing the bottom, but if you use just this block and you put them together, now you've got this nice little star block here in the middle, and then you could also change it so that it's facing out, and this is the pattern that you would get in the rest of the quilt. So like if you had your star blocks here, then you'll end up getting this different pattern here in between them, and I'll try and put a couple together so you could see that. But even just using this block by itself, you would get, again, the main star block, and then you would get this alternate block here in between them, right here. It would be different for each one, especially because I didn't use the pieces to cut out these white sections, so all of these seams will be a little bit different for each block. But this is a cute little block that you can do here with this one, and I just wanted to show you all that in case you just wanted to use just this block. This is the really nice little star that you can get from that block. Alright, so here's the layout that I've come up with for my, I guess, scrappy quilt top, if you want to say. So the original layout that I had in mind, I wasn't liking how it was coming out when I started laying it out. And based on the number of colored blocks that I had here, it wasn't going to work out the way I was doing it anyways. So what I did was I started off doing stars first. Well, so my original layout didn't work, and then I started out doing the 4 stars where there was a point there, there, and there. But then doing 4, it wasn't going to work out because of the number of, again, colored blocks that I had. So then instead of doing a whole star, I just did with 3 points and left the opening facing into the quilt, so then the colors would go kind of flow from there. So for each of the points over here, the corresponding color goes in that row. And so I did it for all of the different colors. You can see there. Yeah, so this is what I've come up with. So obviously I went ahead and cut out my filler squares from just plain white yardage. And I filled those in. I had to do half squares. Well, I cut out a square and then I did triangles for these outside edges here. Since my blocks here measure 8 inches, all I did was I cut 8-inch squares, and then I cut them in half to get my little half-piece triangles here that fill in the edges. This way I can have a straight edge on all of my edges of the quilt top. So yeah, I think I like this layout. So now all I have to do is sew it all together. Now it is just going to be straight seams, so if you look at it from this side here, it's just regular squares, and it's going to be straight seams right here all the way up and down, and then right here all the way side to side, if you will. So yeah, so now I just have to start piecing everything together, and this quilt top will be done and ready for me to start the quilting process. So I'm going to go ahead and get to sewing all of these squares together. Alright, so I have it halfway sewn together, so you can see I did all of these little seams here for each strip. So now I just need to actually sew these long seams right here to connect them all together. Alright, so this quilt top is officially done. I love the way it came out. Let's go ahead and have a look at the entire thing. So I love how it came out. I love the colors and the white background. I feel like it really makes the colors pop. And earlier I mentioned that I was going to do a couple of cute little things with some of my focal point blocks. So let's go ahead and look at a couple of these specific blocks to show you what I did. So this block here, I consider this my maroon block just because it is red, but it red like a little bit of a darker color red, so maroon. So now this particular piece of fabric here, this fabric was like a winery style fabric. So it has a bunch of wineries here, the grapes, the grape fields here, and a couple of the trees and stuff. So I made sure that that was going to be facing the right direction. And again, I knew I was going to be doing my blocks on point. So I thought that came out really cute. My green block here, I kind of fussy cut this little butterfly here, and I was able to get one of the little flowers here down on the bottom. So I thought that came out really good. And right next to it is my yellow block, and this one was kind of like dogs in space. You can't really see, but this is a spaceship or a rocket ship here. But I did it in a way where it looked like the dog was kind of zooming down, coming from outer space, I guess, if you will. So that one came out super cute. And this is my medium to light blue block. This one I think is probably my favorite out of all of them just because I really love the color blue. But this fabric here is really, really pretty. It actually has a lot of details, but again, I kind of fussy cut with this tree here in the middle, and then it's got these two birds on either side and a couple of little foliage, flower details around it. Again, I really like how this came out. So while it looks kind of complicated, it's actually really easy. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it's all straight seams. For my seams, because I do have points where they meet up, I did press my seams for each of my rows here in opposite directions. This way they could nest nicely when sewing everything together. So I did do that. For my long seams here, I pressed them all going down. That didn't necessarily matter direction-wise just because you're not meeting up with any other seams. But because it's white and you would be able to see the seams behind it, I wanted them all going the same direction. So they are all pressed down. And yeah, I really love how it came out. Didn't use as many scraps as I was wanting to, but when I originally started the layout that I had something different, but as I was laying it out, I didn't like how it was coming together. So I went with this instead, and I really love how it turned out. So the measurements for this quilt is 68 by 85 and a half. There are 6 squares essentially all the way across. Now that's whole squares, so there are 6 whole squares across and 8 whole squares down. And then of course I do have my half squares to fill in the edges, or triangles if you'd like. So yeah, again, these are 8-inch squares. They were 8 inches when I cut them out, and finished they are 7.5 by 7.5. There are so many different layouts that you can do for this specific block, and so many different color options. I was thinking you could even do like neon colors, like hot pink, green, blue, and maybe a black background, and those neon colors would really, really pop against the black. So all that's left for this quilt is the actual quilting and then binding, but that's going to be in a future video, so make sure to keep an eye out for that. If you're interested in the ruler that I used to make this block, or the rotating cutting mat that I use, go ahead and check out the description. I have the links to everything from today's video. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comment section down below. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and until next time, I will see you all later.